There may also be some attention to prison reform and conditions in local jails. The Huffington Post has been looking into that whole issue. Senior Justice reporter Ryan Reilly taking time to come in the studio this morning. Ryan, thank you for coming in. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Thanks for
What
having
have you looked at? What have you found?
So essentially what we did in the year after Sandra Bland's death, we basically tried to track every jail death in the country. There's a lot of attention around that issue, and, the conclusion was that she committed suicide. And, I mean, suicides are a big problem in jails, and actually the latest data that we have out showed that the most suicides in jails occurred in 2014 than any other year since at least 2000. It's a really major issue, and the amazing thing there is that they're very easily preventable. So our first story in July focused on looking at basically how you stop these jail suicides. We went back and once we gathered that data, we tried to refine it because we were collecting this from all across the country. We had to go to local jails, we had to go to states and get all this data and put it together. And we tried to figure out where basically the deadliest jails were.
Are these people not under supervision or?
Yeah, so I mean, like, there's for suicides, there's a number of steps you could take to sort of prevent people from, taking their lives. First is sort of screening and trying to determine whether or not you need to put them under any sort of like closer supervision to make sure. But there's also just like very simple things you could do in terms of like the actual facilities. Like one thing that people use a lot is air vents to hang themselves. So if you get rid of the air vents, you replace them with something that's sort of resistant or won't allow anyone to hang anything up there. You take away things that can be easily ripped. Sheets are a big thing. There's like more suicide resistant sheets that a lot of facilities can buy. But, the other side of this is medical care. And, the medical care in jails often isn't, up to snuff. And people don't have the full history of an individual when they come in. And often, this is a point in someone's life where they're under a lot of stress and obviously getting arrested. It's a major point of contention in someone's life and can often have deadly consequences.
Yeah, which could push them over the edge, right?
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
So are most of the deaths in jails you found suicides? As opposed to police abuse or excessive violence on the part of the guards or police officers?
Well, what's interesting is often you'll find, suicide is the leading single cause of death, but a lot of the natural deaths that are, initially labeled natural deaths, the local coverage will say, okay, this happened, or, this happened, they died of a natural cause, health conditions.
Yeah.
And when you look closer at it, when you actually get the records, it turns out that there is some sort of altercation that set that off. And they may have had some underlying health problems, but, so one case, Michael Sabi, that we covered and sort of broke exclusively and put the video up, was this guy who they said, he was a big guy, but they said he had some heart problems and he died, and that was sort of the initial story that came out. And then it turns out that he had gone repeatedly to medical, said, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. They pepper sprayed him in the face, they tackled him to the ground, they tossed him in a cell, didn't check on him like they were supposed to for all this time, and he ended up dying. And this was just a guy who, the charges for him was he got into an argument with his wife and was charged with a version of assault, but there wasn't actually any physical contact, obviously. This is a misdemeanor offense, and he just didn't have the money to bail out.
Is this something that, because pardon my ignorance, but like, is this something that jails have been doing in the past? Has it gotten worse, or is it just like, oh, we're just now realizing that we should probably take better care of our people so they don't do things like this?
Yeah, in the 80s and 90s, this is a lot worse. There was a level of improvement to some extent, but I mean that was really disturbing. I mean, in terms of 2014, which actually when we first put this project out, we put it out, I guess last week, the day after they finally put out the 2014 numbers.
Of course.
Right. So I mean, we're talking about it was almost 3 full years. You're talking about like where we didn't know what's happening, and even now with 2014, when we're like, okay, so now we know that 3 years ago, basically over 2 years ago, we had really high levels of jail deaths and we had really high suicide rates. So what do we do about that now? Like that was a big component of this is like, what do we focus on if we don't learn until a lot down the line?
All right. So how many people are we talking about?
So over the course of a year, it's like usually 1,000 people die. And the rate is roughly 140 per every 100,000 inmates. So, obviously the levels in prison are higher because some people die of just, old age and people are in there for longer. But jail is, a very temporary situation. You're only in there for, a short period of time usually before you can, bail out. Some people end up being in there for longer. One guy that was chronically ill was in there only because he had a misdemeanor pot charge. and couldn't afford $100 for a bail bond. Like he was just broke. So that's like the really tragic situations. I mean, all these are tragedies, but when it's just someone who literally just didn't have the money to bail out, and taxpayers are paying for them to be in there and getting really poor care.
So somebody could be in there like Sandra Bland for something as innocuous as a traffic violation, right, or whatever. But 1,000 people a year nationwide.
Yeah.
All right. I want to guess on the worst state that you found. Okay, I'm going to say Alabama.
Because I've spent some time in Alabama, I don't disagree, but our slogan is "Thank God for Mississippi," so I'm going to say Mississippi.
Or it could be Texas. It's one of those three.
Yeah.
Texas actually has recently, after the Sandra Bland incident,
Are we close? No?
So we don't have the state level. It's tough to determine it that way because we don't have the full state. Like we focus on the actual individual facilities,
right?
Where some of them were. So a lot of them were in Virginia, and three of the facilities that had the highest death rates were in Virginia. Now, I mean, so the way we calculated this is we focused on basically on population. So we didn't say like, oh, this place had the most jail deaths. We said this place has the highest jail death rate. And there were some problematic facilities in Texas, but Virginia had some facilities, especially this Hampton Roads facility, which is now under federal investigation, that have a lot of really, deep problems. And, one thing that is really interesting, too, that I didn't realize when we started looking into this is, I mean, the poor pay rates for jail guards really, I think, factor into this. We have, it's tough to really keep people, hold people accountable because it's such a transitionary job, and it's such a it's a job that doesn't pay well, and people aren't really that worried about maybe hanging on to because they can jump somewhere else. I mean, some of these places, the one facility, it's a private facility where Michael Sabi died on the border of Texas and Arkansas. They only get paid $10 an hour starting out. So I mean, this isn't a situation where it's this really high paid job that they're worried about holding on to.
Right. Yeah. No, I was thinking about. I mean, they're very powerful at the federal level or even at the state level. The prison guards are a very powerful union, too.
Yeah.
I'm surprised but I guess that doesn't factor down into the at the local jail.
Yeah, I mean, and some of them are privatized. So I mean, that was the case with the Texarkana jail. That was a private facility. It's basically they contracted it out, and they say, okay, here's how much for medical care. And it turns out that the doctor, who they actually said, okay, you're the doctor for this jail facility, he lives like he's an internalist who lives 150 miles away. So it's like, okay, in the contract, it's like, oh, every 2 weeks maybe you'll actually show up physically at the facility.
Are there more and more private jails?
Yeah.
I keep confusing. Your focus is on jails, not on prisons, right?
Yeah.
But I know there's a problem on the prison side. I just finished Bernie Sanders' book, and he's got a whole discussion about privatizing prisons and that people should not be able to make a profit over keeping people in jail. That's a public responsibility. Taxpayers pay for it. But to what extent is privatization happening at the jail level?
It's definitely happening there as well. I think the reason we focused on jails was because essentially we're talking about, this is a situation that literally anyone could find themselves in. It's like you could get arrested for a lot of stuff in this country, and if you're in the wrong situation, you can get arrested for it. So it's a situation that anyone should be able to see themselves in. I think it's tougher, and it's more of a challenge for people to connect themselves as someone who's like been sentenced to a prison term, which obviously there's a lot of important issues happening there.
Yeah.
But anybody can be arrested for something, and anybody can wind up in jail. You may be able to bail out very quickly if you have some access to money, but you could end up there. So I think that's one of the reasons that we focused on that is before anyone's been convicted of anything. Privatization is a problem there. I mean, in a lot of places, and including this place where they, and now there's another case where in the same facility where a nurse has now been charged because someone died of diabetes, and she ignored them, and she injected them with the wrong thing at the end of her life, so that ended up spiking her sugar level, and she died. And it's a 20-year-old. I mean, a 20-year-old girl that we're talking about here, who if had proper medical care, would never have been in that situation.